If you have any questions for Dr. Cantrell, please throw them in the chat, and I'll send them along his way. Um, I wanted to start, Jeff, and ask a question myself, which is, um, you get the opportunity to get 4,428 acres plus, 7 square miles of land, and a lot of people came for that, like 20,000 by the time Tehran is inspecting colonies and checking things out. Why would people not come and take advantage of that? If you're in Mississippi or Illinois or wherever in the United States and they're saying, "Hey, land, come and get it, baby," why would people not take advantage of that?
Well, I mean, Indians, okay, for one thing. So people were pretty fond of holding on to their scalps, and the Comanches were again the Comanche. They had a well-deserved reputation as being bad dudes. If you ran afoul of them, and moving into their hunting lands, into their lands, is pretty much running afoul of them. So people were very concerned about Indians. I mean, these people, these American frontiersmen, they grew up, many of them on the frontier, or heard stories from their parents from the frontier in the United States, and the typical American frontiersman in the early 19th century did not cotton to Indians and were pretty afraid of Indians. And the ones in Texas were they had earned the right to be feared. So there's that. And then of course, these are patriotic Americans, many of them. They think they live in the greatest country on earth, uh, and they're going to move to Mexico. Some people, it took a special kind of person, I think, to do that. Uh, to pick up everything you own, move your family, maybe never see your loved ones again, right? Back in Tennessee or South Carolina, wherever you came from. So you had to really think about it, and then you read you read Austin's papers, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens of letters from prospective colonists writing into Austin saying, "Hey, what about slavery? If I bring my slaves, is it going to be secure?" And every time the state or the national government made some move that seemed to be anti-slavery, there'd be another whole flood of these letters coming into Austin, asking, dare we come? So there were a lot of reasons why people would have thought twice about it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a great segue to a question CJ had, which I'll just read directly what CJ wrote. Can you, Dr. Cantrell, elaborate on slavery in Texas? Was it originally allowed under the federal impresario grants, but not the state impresario grants? And how did the, quote, indentured servants policy work?
Right. Well, so yes, it is allowed originally. Slavery had almost died out in Mexico by 1821. By the time of Mexican independence, uh, slavery had African slavery had been a part of the scene in Mexico, going back centuries, but it had never caught on in Mexico the way it did in many other places in Latin America and the Caribbean, like Cuba or Brazil, for example. And by 1821, there are only, I forget the number, you may know it, Andrew, but a few thousand actual slaves. Um,
African
and,
slaves, yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I mean, it's a very small number. And so slavery was sort of a dying institution. Now, there was lots of unfree exploited labor in Mexico, right? There's massive, a huge percentage of the population where some some variety of peons, right? But a sort of unfree system of labor. But there weren't slaves. But there was nothing in the Constitution of 1824. Um, there was nothing in Austin's initial impresario contract, his federal contract, that prohibited slaves from being brought in. But these were idealistic times in Mexico. There were many Mexican statesmen at the state and national level who really sort of They saw themselves as part of the Enlightenment. Okay, they saw this. The United States had been the first real republic in modern history, and then it had been followed by some others, and now the Latin American countries are earning their or gaining their freedom from Spain, and a lot of these Mexican statesmen really took the ideas of natural rights um, seriously, and they applied that to the institution of slavery. Uh, Very much like a lot of northern statesmen in the northern United States at the time at the time of the American Revolution, anti-slavery, because slavery was basically gone in the northern states by then anyway, right? So you're John Adams or John Hancock or someone, you don't have a big interest in slavery. You can sort of be anti-slavery and want the United States to not embrace it. That's sort of the way a lot of statesmen were in Mexico, and so they start when it becomes clear down in Saltillo, in the state capital, that hey, these Anglo Texans are flooding in here with not a majority of them by any stretch of imagination, but still slavery. Everybody sort of understood that by 1824 or 5, slavery is going to be sort of the foundation of this Anglo-American economy. Austin made no bones about it. He knew he argued repeatedly. You want Texas to become prosperous and populated, you've got to allow slavery. Even then, they passed that. What is it? 1825 law, I believe it is. You know better than I do, Andrew.
Which one?
The initial sort of anti-slavery law, the gradual emancipation law at the state level.
That's the Saltillo Constitution, 1826.
Okay, it's 26.
27.
The first state constitution, 1826, outlaws slavery, and then of course they engineer this. The next year, they engineer a bill that allows for indentured servants, and of course, then the Americans stop that. They would literally stop at the last, notary public's office before the crossing over the Sabine River, and free their slaves, and immediately have those slaves sign a 99-year contract of indenture, right? They could be free in 99 years. So this is the subterfuge that they use. Then comes the 1829 National Emancipation Law, which Austin manages to get Texas exempted for. So it was this back and forth thing. But anytime there's this seems like sort of sustained assault on an institution that means a lot to you, it's going to really create a lot of concern. And so, it took a long time for scholars to really understand how big a deal slavery was, because, well, it seemed like slavery was, most Anglo immigrants were not slaveholders, and it seemed like, the indentured servant loophole was okay. So for a long time, historians described slavery as a sort of dull organic ache. The famous early Texas historian Eugene C. Barker used that phrase. It was a dull organic ache, but it wasn't a major factor in the revolution. Well, thanks particularly to one Andrew Torget, we can now understand what a major factor it was.
Well, that dovetails with something that Michelle asked about how they limited slavery, but I think you covered that. I will tell everybody, if you're interested in Mexico's perspective on slavery and how it played out in places other than Texas, there's a great new book by a historian named Alice Baumgartner that just came out, and it goes into great depth on those topics in a beautiful way. So I'll put that in the chat for the title of that for anyone who's interested. So Greg, another question was one from Mario. Is he's covering the Fredonian Rebellion right now in class, and so he wanted to know if you had any advice on how to make lessons about the Fredonian Rebellion engaging. He says for his 7th grade computer zombies. But I would say we have to make it engaging also in our classrooms when we have 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who can also be quite zombie-like sometimes. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you teach the Fredonian Rebellion in your classroom?
Well, this is going to sound like a cop out, but I have to defer to the professional teachers of Texas history at the seventh grade level. All of you folks that are in the audience tonight. I've never taught a minute to seventh graders or anybody else below the college level. So I'm probably not the best guy to ask that. Probably all of you guys have a lot better ideas about how to teach it. That said, one of my documents that we're about to look at does involve the Fredonian Rebellion, and it's a letter from Stephen F. Austin to one of the rebels who's happened to be a personal acquaintance of his from back in the Missouri, his Missouri days, and so we'll look at that, and maybe that will give you some ideas. I do like to use these Austin was just beside himself when he learned about this rebellion that has been announced
You can hear it in his letters where he's
and
screaming about it.
he must have written with that quill, goose quill pen till his hand hurt, because he is just firing off letters to East Texas, to anybody that he thinks will listen to him, and firing off letters the other direction to the Mexican officials in San Antonio and Goliad and Saltillo and Mexico City, trying to keep this thing under control, trying to tamp it down in East Texas, and trying to reassure the Mexican government that, oh no, this is not as bad as it sounds. We've got it under, we'll deal with it. So, you can go to the digital Austin papers edited by one Andrew Torgett, which are readily available online. They're keyword searchable, and you can find a bunch of these documents, and you can give them to students. And seventh grade students, seventh graders are smart. You give them a letter like the one we're going to look at here in a few minutes, and they can draw a lot of conclusions, I think, from those kind of letters, and there's because these letters ended up touching on slavery and Indians and lots of other things, not just the fact that this band of American adventurers have decided to declare the independence of Texas from Mexico. You can get into a lot of the motives by looking at these documents.
Yeah, I think it's great. I really do. I love showing them the perspective of Austin's like actual words about how he's dealing with this. So setting it up as a back and forth.
He'll say things like, "I refuse to believe that you have all run mad."
Yeah, have you all gone mad or worse? Yeah. He gets. You can feel the foaming at the mouth as he's so angry about it. See, all right. So jumping into somebody else who was talking about the Edwards grant real fast. One of the questions from Roberta was, how did the Mexican government, which this would have been the Saltillo government that gave Edwards his grant, I assume, in East Texas, but how did they overlook the fact that there were so many people living already in the area they handed to him? Like, it seems like an impossible situation, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's the thing. Sound like Joe Biden. Here's the thing. The extent of knowledge about Texas, but particularly about that part of East Texas, was so limited. It's what, 350, 400 miles. I don't know the exact distance, but it is a long slog from Nacogdoches to Saltillo, right? And the lawmakers in the state legislature in Saltillo, none of those guys had ever been to East Texas. They didn't know what was going on there. The government, such as it was in Nacogdoches, in that department of Texas, had ceased to function in the final years of the Mexican Wars for Independence. And it had been very slow to sort of get back on its feet. And the information just wasn't there. They didn't know much about that. And of course, if you want to talk about what they knew about Texas and Mexico City, it's that times 10. That's why they have to send Tehran in 1828. Nobody knows anything about this crazy place, Texas. Nobody knows who's there, how many people are there, what sort of people they are, how they make their living. They didn't know anything. They knew they were Indians.
And that's what's a hard thing, I think, for our students at the college level. I can
Yeah,
imagine for 12-year-olds, like having the idea of limited information, because most of us can pick up our
yeah,
phones and look up almost anything
yeah,
instantaneously. And we forget there's a period where you can not know a lot and
yeah.
have to make decisions based on that.
And communication, I mean, once you found out something, it could take months for, for a letter to make it from Texas to Saltillo or Mexico City.
Exactly. I want to end with a question from a gentleman named Daniel, who was asking, I think, a really interesting one about, was there any efforts at all on behalf of the Anglos to assimilate into Mexican culture? And I was going to, you can take that on, but I'd like to expand it too. If you could talk a little bit about just the interactions and sometimes lack thereof between the Anglo colonists and the Tejanos, and then Mexican officials like Tehran, and just their experience with Mexico in a broad sort of sense.
Yeah. So, this was Stephen F. Austin's sort of fondest hope, was that the American settlers in Texas would learn Spanish, uh, sort of absorb certain amounts of Mexican culture, maybe maybe American men marry Mexican women, and he did everything he could in those early years. He would call a gathering of the colonists, and and raise the have a big ceremony and raise the Mexican flag and have everybody swear loyalty to the Constitution of 1824. He would go through all these sorts of things and write a gazillion letters, all constantly reminding the colonists of the many, many favors the government has done for you, and how you must be loyal. You promised to be loyal when you came in. And Austin went out of his way, of course, very, very prudently, to learn Spanish himself. He didn't speak a lick of Spanish when he went to Mexico City. By the time he left at the end of the year, he was speaking it fluently. And he wanted other people to learn. And there were some examples of that. There were some Americans who, mostly the ones who moved and ended up living in the Tejano settlements, right? Those who, James Bowie, for example, moves
Mhm.
to moves to San Antonio and marries the governor's daughter, right? Um, there were a few examples of people like that. Uh, but most Anglo Americans didn't want to go to San Antonio or Goliad or South, anywhere in what was then they called West Texas. They wanted American style farms and or plantations, and that meant it was going to be Austin's colony or points east. Uh, Geographers have used the phrase cluster migration to talk about how people moved, and a whole neighborhood would pick up from some part of Tennessee and move and settle in some part of East Texas that sort of reminded them of home. The terrain and the topography, the soil, whatever, sort of reminded them of home, hoping to sort of reproduce the lifestyle that they had enjoyed in the United States, only with these vast domains of land, right? And the opportunities that could go with that. So the Anglos tended to sort of self-segregate, I guess is the short answer to that question. And there was not very much interaction.
Yeah.
Uh, the only real interaction comes when in the aftermath of 1830, Mexico starts sending detachments of Mexican troops to East Texas. Then
Right.
there are problems.
Like after 1830 with Anahuac
After
and
1830.
Velasco, when they start putting troops
Yeah.
into East Texas
I mean,
locations.
but I mean, there are, all the way to the Texas Revolution, there are some, there are numbers of Anglo settlers who did what Austin wanted to do. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a small band of so-called Tories rooting for the Mexican side in the Texas Revolution. People don't know about those, but it Tehran was right when he wrote back to the government in 1829 and said, "Look, these Anglos are not assimilating; they are not becoming Mexicans, and it will only take the certain right amount of the right match struck and thrown on the fire will be all it takes to ignite it. And of course, he was right about all that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. And we'll move rapidly now into the document session.